Okay, so this is something that I spoke about some time back, but I think it's well worth revisiting. But before I do, go and do the whole normal subscribe and notification bell thing and all of that, and maybe more people will get to watch this stuff. Maybe it'll make somebody think. And as important as that is, comment, please. I would like to hear your views on this stuff. It's actually quite important to me to get input from the outside, as it were. So this goes about the reasonable man or uh, reasonable person standard, and it's a test in legal cases applied to determine if someone's actions would be subjectively congruent with the expected behavior. The question is, what would a reasonable person have done in the same situation? And this is essentially an objective ideal created so that those tasked with deciding the merits of a situation might have something on which they can objectively reflect during deliberation. And I'm fairly sure you're familiar with the concept. And it's natural that in some instances there's reduced objectivity, and so some concept like this would hopefully offset the bias and make decisions more neutral or reasonable while considering the multitude of effects that emotive issues naturally produce. You also need to ask, does this reasonable person actually exist? Now, negligence in legal terms can become a complicated affair, but let's consider hypothetically for a moment the the way the country is being managed, the problems we all encounter regularly are they avoidable? And the short answer is yes, but that's the short answer. The situation has been allowed to develop over decades and has resulted in a situation that would be impossible to call acceptable. Why is this? I think that there are a multitude of contributing factors, but by far the most relevant seems to be that everyone merely accepts the situation. Why do we allow those who produce substandard results to continue doing so? If a politician is in a position to influence society and as a result, or rather the results are negative, why is that continued? Why is it allowed to, why is the behavior or the influence, why is it accepted? What is it that makes the general population so terribly ignorant and self destructive? That, after all, is what the behavior is, self destructive. And I think we have allowed a situation to develop where taxpayers are threatened into paying in order to sustain the corruption. Something that people need to wake up to is that just because some politician smiles and says that they are trying their best and that they acknowledge how big the problem is and that it is all the fault of someone before them and so on, does not actually make it so. So the real question should be, why are people that are not capable of any large degree of future thinking allowed to keep those abusers of public trust in power? What do you think would change if at the next election only taxpayers were allowed to vote? Simply if the number of votes you are able to cast equated to the amount of tax you paid. That would produce a more realistic situation rather than a ballot being heavily biased by those that are not productive in their own favour. Now, let's consider the reasonable man scenario. I think it's fair to assume that the taxpayers, those that are productive, those that are enterprising to the point of being financially productive, those that provide employment, those that have a bigger picture in mind, I think it fair to consider them to be generally reasonable. But are they? Is the man, the woman that perpetuates the situation by paying diligently reasonable? Is it reasonable to expect that the system is productive when the resultant failures are evidenced all around us? Is it reasonable to expect a politician that clearly cannot manage the situation to somehow change the result they consistently produce? Let me tell you what I think. I think it's not reasonable. I do not think it's reasonable that a member of society that does not contribute positively to the future is allowed to so heavily influence the future of those that are concerned with contributing to a productive society. I do not think it's reasonable that those in positions of power or influence are allowed to continue in those positions when the main reason they are there is to protect those in the rusted chain above them. I don't think it's reasonable to put people that are not qualified specifically for those positions of influence into those positions. In a reasonable circumstance, realistic qualification criteria would be met. Realistically, though. Not some politically correct qualification like ethnic background or gender or demographic representation or any other similar misguided excuse. Actual experience with evidence of success to support it. Reasonably, you will find that it is the last person that wants to do the job that may be the most qualified. What does the future hold for all those millions of citizens that have not the aptitude to consider these things? What lies ahead for those that are so focused on daily survival that they do not have the freedom to explore these things? Are their children destined to live the same life, just scraping by, just so focused on survival and avoiding the pitfalls that they merely carry the system forward? Surely, as thinking human beings, we collectively want more from the future. Consider again what is reasonable about keeping in a position of influence the people that are causing the problems to not only not be solved, but that are actually making the situation worse. And I can talk at length about the problems that exist, but that's not going to solve the real problem of changing the source of the problem. And if your initial reaction to this, to any of this, has been negative, then sadly you are part of the problem, or at least you are part of the reason why the problem persists. So take off your political allegiance hat and step aside from your ego and your need to be right. Step away from your worry about what your friends might think if they saw you considering something different. Step back and consider if it's reasonable that the entire nation is brought to the level of the lowest common denominator because of insecurity and corruption, fear of losing control. These things alone are the real motivation for those in control, desperately clinging to their power, and should be enough to make the reasonable man do everything to avoid continuing the current situation any longer. So give it some thought, because your future actually depends on all of this stuff, as to the future of anyone you know, including your children. Give it some thought.